David Williams checked his watch as he turned onto Maple Street. He was running a few minutes late for dinner with his mother, but traffic had been heavier than expected. The evening sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched between expensive houses. At 38 years old, David had worked hard for everything he owned. His black BMW sedan was 3 years old but well-maintained. He'd saved up for months to buy it, knowing that reliable transportation was important for his demanding job. Today, like every other day, he wore a crisp white shirt and navy tie, even though his workday had officially ended an hour ago. As he drove down the tree-lined street, David noticed how different this neighborhood felt from where he'd grown up. Everything here screamed money and privilege. The houses were huge, with circular driveways and 3-car garages. Even the streetlights looked expensive, casting a warm glow over sidewalks that probably cost more than most people's cars. His mother had moved to a small apartment just outside this area 6 months ago, to be closer to her doctor. David made this drive twice a week, bringing groceries and checking on her health. At 72, she was still independent, but he worried about her living alone. David slowed down as he approached a 4-way stop. A jogger with expensive headphones ran past, barely glancing at his car. A woman walking a small dog crossed the street, her designer handbag swinging as she moved. This was clearly a neighborhood where people minded their own business and expected others to do the same. He was checking his GPS when he noticed the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. David's heart sank as he pulled over to the curb, carefully positioning his car away from traffic. He'd been driving for 20 years and had only been pulled over twice, both times for minor speeding violations that he'd deserved. But today was different. David knew he hadn't been speeding. He'd been going exactly 25 miles per hour in the residential zone. His seatbelt was on, his phone was in the passenger seat untouched, and he'd come to complete stops at every sign. Officer Jenkins approached the driver's side window with slow, deliberate steps. David had already turned off the engine and placed both hands on the steering wheel, just like his father had taught him years ago. The officer was a heavy-set man in his 40s, with a stern expression that seemed permanently etched on his face. "License and registration," Officer Jenkins said without any greeting. His tone was sharp and commanding, the kind of voice that expected immediate compliance. "Of course, officer," David replied calmly. He reached slowly for his wallet, making sure to announce each movement. "I'm reaching for my wallet now. My registration is in the glove compartment." Officer Jenkins watched every move with suspicious eyes. When David handed over his documents, the officer barely glanced at them before looking back at the car. "This your vehicle?" Jenkins asked, his voice carrying an undertone that made David uncomfortable. "Yes, sir. I bought it 3 years ago." The officer walked around to the front of the car, examining it like he was looking for evidence of a crime. "What do you do for work?" David paused. It was an odd question during a routine traffic stop. "I work for the government." "Government, huh?" Jenkins smirked. "What kind of government work pays for a car like this?" The question hit David like a slap. He could hear the assumption in the officer's voice, the implication that someone who looked like him couldn't possibly afford a decent car through honest work. David had heard these kinds of comments before, usually from people who assumed his success was somehow suspicious or undeserved. "I work hard for everything I have, officer," David said, keeping his voice steady. "Is there a reason you pulled me over today?" Jenkins didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the back of the car and crouched down near the taillight. David watched in his side mirror, confused about what the officer was doing back there. "Your left taillight is out," Jenkins announced as he returned to the window. David frowned. "That's impossible, officer. I just had my car inspected last month. Everything was working fine this morning when I left for work. Are you telling me I don't know what I'm looking at?" Jenkins' voice rose slightly, taking on an aggressive edge. "No, sir. I'm just saying that the light was working earlier today. Maybe something happened during my drive." Jenkins leaned down closer to the window. David could smell coffee on his breath and see the irritation in his eyes. "Son, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know a broken taillight when I see one." And I also know suspicious driving when I see it. Suspicious driving? David couldn't hide his confusion. Officer, I was going 25 in a 25 zone. I stopped at every stop sign. I'm not sure what was suspicious about my driving. You were looking around a lot, checking out the houses. People in this neighborhood don't like strangers casing their property. The accusation stung. David realized that his simple act of admiring the neighborhood had been interpreted as something sinister. He thought about explaining that his mother lived nearby, but something in the officer's tone warned him that more information might not help his situation. I was just driving to visit my mother, officer. I come this way twice a week. Jenkins straightened up and tapped his pen against his citation book. Well, today you're getting a ticket for that taillight, and I'm adding a citation for suspicious driving patterns. David's jaw tightened. He'd never heard of a ticket for suspicious driving patterns, and he was pretty sure it wasn't a real violation. But arguing with an officer on the side of the road rarely ended well for anyone, especially someone in his position. Officer, could you please check the taillight again? I'd really like to understand what's wrong with it. I don't need to check anything twice. The light is out, and that's a safety violation. Jenkins was already writing in his citation book, his pen moving quickly across the paper. As David sat there watching the officer write what he knew was an unfair ticket, he thought about all the times his father had warned him about situations like this. Keep your hands visible, speak respectfully, don't argue, and live to fight another day, his father had always said. But sitting in his legally owned car, having followed every traffic law, getting a ticket for violations he hadn't committed, David felt the familiar burn of injustice that he'd hoped he'd never have to experience again. Jenkins handed him the citation with a satisfied look. Court date is 3 weeks from today. You can contest it if you want, but Judge Mitchell doesn't have much patience for people who waste his time. David took the ticket and nodded. Thank you, officer. As Jenkins walked back to his patrol car, David sat in silence for a moment. The sun was setting now, casting the expensive neighborhood in golden light. Somewhere nearby, his mother was waiting for him to arrive for dinner. But first, he needed a minute to process what had just happened. He looked at the citation in his hands. 2 violations he hadn't committed, issued by an officer who seemed to have made up his mind about David before asking a single question. The unfairness of it burned in his chest, but David had learned long ago that sometimes the system worked differently for people who looked like him. Starting his car, David carefully pulled back into traffic. In his rearview mirror, he could see the officer still sitting in his patrol car, probably running his license through the system. David wondered what Officer Jenkins would think when he discovered exactly who he'd just given a bogus ticket to. 3 weeks from now, David would find out. 3 weeks later, David sat in the back row of Traffic Court Number 3, watching as Judge Harold Mitchell processed case after case with the efficiency of an assembly line. The courtroom smelled like old wood and industrial cleaner, and the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over everything. David had arrived 30 minutes early, partly out of habit, and partly because he wanted to observe how the judge handled other cases. What he saw troubled him. Judge Mitchell seemed to have 2 completely different approaches depending on who stood before him. When a well-dressed elderly woman contested her parking ticket, the judge listened patiently to her explanation about the broken meter. He reduced her fine and wished her a good day. When a young Latino man tried to explain that he couldn't afford his speeding ticket, Mitchell cut him off mid-sentence and added court costs for wasting the court's time. The pattern was unmistakable. David had seen it before in courtrooms across the country, but experiencing it firsthand still made his stomach turn. He pulled out a small notebook and began taking notes, a habit he'd developed during his years in law school. David Williams, the clerk called out. David stood and walked to the defendant's table, straightening his tie as he moved. He'd chosen his outfit carefully today, a dark gray suit, white shirt, and conservative blue tie. He carried a leather briefcase containing photos of his working taillight and documentation of his recent vehicle inspection. Judge Mitchell didn't look up from his paperwork when David approached. At 61 years old, Mitchell had been on the bench for 2 decades. His gray hair was slicked back, and his black robe seemed to add weight to his already imposing presence. "You're here to contest citation number." Mitchell squinted at the file. 7829. Broken taillight and suspicious. Driving patterns. Yes, Your Honor. I believe there's been a mistake. Mitchell finally looked up, and David saw something shift in the judge's expression. It was subtle but unmistakable. A hardening around the eyes, a slight tightening of the jaw. A mistake? Mitchell's voice carried a tone of amused disbelief. Officer Jenkins has been writing traffic citations for 15 years. Are you suggesting he doesn't know what he's looking at? Your Honor, I'm not questioning Officer Jenkins's experience. I'm simply saying that my taillight was working properly on the day in question. I have photos taken the next morning showing both taillights functioning normally. David reached into his briefcase to retrieve the photos, but Judge Mitchell held up a hand to stop him. Son, I don't need to see pictures. Officer Jenkins checked your taillight on the scene. His word carries significant weight in this courtroom. The word son rankled David. He was 38 years old with a law degree and years of courtroom experience. But Judge Mitchell was addressing him like a child who didn't understand how the world worked. Your Honor, I also have documentation showing that my vehicle passed state inspection just 1 month before this citation was issued. Every light was tested and certified as working. That was a month ago, Mitchell said dismissively. Taillights burn out all the time. And frankly, young man, you seem to have a lot of excuses for something that should be pretty straightforward. David felt his jaw tighten. The judge was refusing to look at evidence before making his decision. This wasn't how the justice system was supposed to work, even in traffic court. Your Honor, regarding the second citation for suspicious driving patterns, I was traveling at exactly the speed limit and obeying all traffic laws. I'm not sure what behavior could be considered suspicious. Judge Mitchell leaned back in his chair and studied David with obvious skepticism. Officer Jenkins noted that you were looking around at the houses in the neighborhood, checking things out. People who live in Willowbrook pay good money for privacy and security. They don't appreciate strangers cruising around, scoping out their property. I was driving to visit my mother, Your Honor. She lives in an apartment complex just outside that neighborhood. I make that drive twice a week. Uh-huh. Mitchell's tone suggested he didn't believe a word of it. And what kind of work do you do that allows you to afford a BMW and visit your mother twice a week during business hours? David paused. The question was inappropriate and irrelevant to the traffic violations, but he sensed that his answer might influence the judge's decision. I work for the federal government, Your Honor, Mitchell snorted. Federal government, let me guess, you work at the post office? Maintenance crew at the federal building? The assumption stung, but David kept his voice level. I work in the legal department. Mitchell repeated the words like they left a bad taste in his mouth. Well, Mr. Legal Department, let me explain how my courtroom works. Officer Jenkins is a respected member of this community who takes an oath to serve and protect. When he says your taillight was broken and your driving was suspicious, that's good enough for me. David could feel the anger building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Your Honor, I'm simply asking the court to consider the evidence I've brought. I don't need to see your evidence because I trust Officer Jenkins's judgment. What I see here is someone who thinks he can talk his way out of a legitimate citation by questioning a police officer's credibility. Mitchell flipped through the file again, shaking his head as if David's very presence annoyed him. The original fine was $150 for the taillight and $200 for suspicious driving. But since you've wasted this court's time with frivolous arguments and shown disrespect for Officer Jenkins, I'm doubling both fines. That's $700 total, plus court costs of $75. David's eyes widened. Your Honor, that seems excessive for... Are you questioning my judgment now too? Mitchell's voice rose slightly. Son, you need to learn that actions have consequences. You can't just drive around any neighborhood you please and expect to get away with it. There are rules in society, and when you break those rules, you pay the price. The courtroom had gone quiet. David could feel other people staring at him, some with sympathy, others with the kind of morbid curiosity that came with watching someone get publicly humiliated. Maybe next time you'll think twice before driving through neighborhoods where you don't belong, Mitchell continued. Maybe you'll make sure your car is properly maintained before you get behind the wheel. And maybe you'll show proper respect for the officers who risk their lives to keep our communities safe. David stood there absorbing the verbal assault, his legal training warring with his human instincts. Every fiber of his being wanted to respond, to defend himself against the implications and assumptions. But he also knew that arguing further would only make things worse. "You have 30 days to pay the fine," Mitchell said, already reaching for the next file. "If you can't afford it, the court offers payment plans. There are also community service options available, though I suspect someone with a government job can manage $775. The dismissal in Mitchell's voice was complete. David had been judged not just guilty, but unworthy of basic respect or fair treatment. He gathered his papers and stepped away from the table, his face burning with shame and anger. As he walked toward the exit, David heard Mitchell call the next case. "Patricia Thornton, you're here for a parking violation?" "Yes, Your Honor," came a polite female voice. "I was visiting my elderly father at the hospital and didn't realize the meter had expired." "Oh, hospital visit." Mitchell's voice softened immediately. "Well, we certainly can't have people worrying about parking when they're dealing with family medical issues. I'm dismissing this case with a warning. Please be more careful in the future." David stopped walking. The contrast was so stark, so obvious that he almost couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Same judge, same courtroom, same basic traffic violation. But completely different treatment based on nothing more than assumptions about who deserved compassion and who didn't. He pushed through the courtroom doors and stepped into the hallway, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out his phone. $775 for violations he hadn't committed, handed down by a judge who had refused to look at evidence and made assumptions about David's character based on his appearance. David leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. He thought about his father's advice about living to fight another day. Well, today was over, but the fight was just beginning. He opened his notebook and began writing down everything he could remember about the proceeding. Every word, every gesture, every assumption. David had been taking notes in courtrooms for years, but he'd never been the one being judged unfairly. As he wrote, David realized that Judge Mitchell still had no idea who he really was. The man had made assumptions based on stereotypes and refused to listen to evidence. He'd abused his power and shown clear bias in his treatment of different defendants. But David Williams wasn't just another traffic court victim. He was an assistant United States attorney with 15 years of experience in federal court. He understood the system from the inside, and he knew exactly what to do with judges who abused their power. Mitchell had made a serious mistake today. He just didn't know it yet. David had almost reached the courthouse exit when he heard his name being called from behind. He turned to see the court clerk hurrying down the hallway, holding a piece of paper in her hand. "Mr. Williams, sir, there's been an issue with your case file." David stopped and waited as the middle-aged woman caught up to him. She looked flustered, constantly glancing back toward the courtroom as if she was afraid someone might be watching. "What kind of issue?" David asked. "Well, when I was entering your payment information into the computer system, I noticed that your address is listed as 300 Federal Plaza. That's the federal courthouse building, isn't it?" David nodded slowly. "That's correct." The clerk's eyes widened slightly. "And you said you work for the federal government in the legal department?" "Yes, I did." "Oh my." The woman's face had gone pale. "Judge Mitchell asked me to double-check something about your case. He wants to see you back in his chambers." David felt a moment of satisfaction mixed with apprehension. So the judge had finally decided to pay attention to the details. Better late than never, he supposed. "Lead the way," David said. They walked, back through the courthouse, past the busy traffic court where other defendants were still waiting for their cases to be called. The clerk knocked on a heavy wooden door marked, "Judge Harold Mitchell, Private Chambers." "Come in," came Mitchell's voice from inside. The judge's chambers were exactly what David expected. Dark wood paneling, law books lining the walls, diplomas and commendations displayed prominently. Judge Mitchell sat behind an enormous desk, and for the first time that day he looked uncertain. "Mr. Williams, please have a seat." Mitchell's tone was notably different from the dismissive attitude he'd displayed in court. "I was reviewing your case file and noticed some details that weren't clear to me earlier." David sat down but didn't say anything. He wanted to see exactly how this conversation would unfold. "Your address is listed as the Federal Plaza building. Could you clarify what type of work you do there?" "I'm an assistant United States attorney," David said calmly. "I prosecute federal crimes." The color drained from Judge Mitchell's face. He stared at David for a long moment as if trying to process this information. His hands fidgeted with a pen. "On his desk, Assistant U.S. Attorney," Mitchell repeated slowly. "I see. And how long have you held that position?" 15 years. I started as a junior prosecutor right out of law school and worked my way up." Mitchell's jaw worked silently for a moment. David could practically see the wheels turning in the judge's head as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. An assistant U.S. attorney wasn't just any lawyer. They were federal prosecutors who worked closely with FBI agents, handled major criminal cases, and had significant influence within the justice system. 15 years, Mitchell said, more to himself than to David. "And you prosecute federal crimes?" "That's correct. Mostly white-collar crime, public corruption cases, civil rights violations. I also handle appeals in the circuit court." Each word seemed to hit Judge Mitchell like a physical blow. David watched as the reality of the situation sank in. The judge had just publicly humiliated, fined, and lectured a federal prosecutor based on nothing more than racial bias and assumptions. "Mr. Williams, there seems to have been some confusion about your case today." "What kind of confusion?" David kept his voice neutral, professional. Mitchell loosened his tie slightly. Sweat was beginning to form on his forehead despite the air conditioning in his chambers. "Well, perhaps I was too hasty in my ruling. Traffic court moves quickly, and sometimes important details get overlooked." "What details were overlooked?" Your professional background, for instance. If I had realized you were a federal prosecutor." David leaned forward slightly. "Judge Mitchell, are you saying that my profession should have affected how you handled my case?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Mitchell realized he was walking into dangerous territory. If he admitted that David's job should have mattered, he was essentially confessing to giving preferential treatment based on social status. If he denied it, he couldn't explain why he was suddenly backtracking on his earlier ruling. "No, of course not," Mitchell said quickly. "The law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their profession." "Then I'm confused about why we're having this conversation." Mitchell's hands were visibly shaking now. "Mr. Williams, I want to make sure you received fair treatment in my courtroom today. Looking back at the case, I may have been too harsh in my ruling." "Too harsh how?" "The fines. Perhaps. $775 does seem excessive for the violations in question." David tilted his head. "But an hour ago you said the fines were appropriate consequences for my actions. You said I needed to learn that actions have consequences." "Yes, well," Mitchell was clearly struggling. "Upon further reflection, I believe a warning might be more appropriate in this case." "A warning for what exactly?" "For the taillight violation. The taillight that was working properly?" Mitchell's face flushed red. "There seems to be some dispute about the condition of your taillight." "There's no dispute, Judge Mitchell. Officer Jenkins was wrong about my taillight, and you refused to look at evidence that proved it. You also found me guilty of suspicious driving patterns, which isn't even a real traffic violation." The room fell silent. David could hear the air conditioning humming and the muffled sounds of the courthouse beyond the door. Judge Mitchell stared at his desk, unable to meet David's eyes. "Mr. Williams, I'd like to offer you a complete dismissal of all charges." "Based on what new evidence?" Based on a more thorough review of the case." David stood up slowly. "Judge Mitchell, we both know what happened in that courtroom today. You made assumptions about me the moment I walked in. You refused to consider evidence. You doubled my fines for asking questions, and you gave me a lecture about knowing my place in society." Mitchell looked up, panic clear in his eyes. "Mr. Williams, I hope you understand that I treat all defendants fairly, regardless of their background. Do you? Because I sat in your courtroom for 30 minutes before my case was called. I watched you dismiss charges for a woman with a parking violation because she was visiting her father in the hospital. I watched you add court costs to a young man's fine for trying to explain his financial situation. The pattern was pretty clear." "There's no pattern," Mitchell said desperately. "Each case is decided on its own merits." David picked up his briefcase. "Judge Mitchell, I've been practicing law for 15 years. I've appeared before dozens of judges in federal court. I know what fair treatment looks like, and what I experienced today wasn't it." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that dismissing my case now doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't change the fact that you showed clear bias in your courtroom. And it doesn't help all the other people who don't have the benefit of being federal prosecutors when they face the same treatment." Mitchell's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Williams, I hope you won't let this unfortunate misunderstanding affect our professional relationship going forward." David paused at the door. "Judge Mitchell, we don't have a professional relationship. I practice in federal court, not state court. But I do have colleagues who appear before you regularly, and I have friends in the civil rights community who are very interested in patterns of judicial bias." "Are you threatening me?" "No, sir. I'm simply stating facts. What happened today was documented by court reporters and witnessed by a room full of people. Whether or not it becomes a bigger issue depends on what you do next." David opened the door to leave, but Mitchell called out one more time. "What do you want from me?" David turned back. "I want you to remember this feeling the next time someone stands in your courtroom who looks like me. I want you to remember that your assumptions were wrong, your treatment was unfair, and your power was abused. And I want you to do better." With that, David walked out of the chambers, leaving Judge Mitchell alone with the crushing realization of what he had done. The judge sat in silence for a long time, staring at the case file that contained all the information he should have paid attention to from the beginning. Outside in the hallway, David felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. He'd proven his point, but it shouldn't have taken revealing his professional status to get fair treatment. How many other people had sat in that same courtroom and received the same biased treatment without having the credentials to fight back? David pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for the State Judicial Conduct Board. He had some calls to make. David spent the next morning in his office on the 15th floor of the Federal Plaza building, staring out at the city skyline while he considered his options. His desk was covered with case files from ongoing prosecutions, but his mind kept returning to what had happened in Judge Mitchell's courtroom. His assistant knocked on the door and stepped inside. "David, there's a reporter from Channel 7 News, on line 2. "She says it's about a court case?" David frowned. "I didn't call any reporters. She mentioned something about a traffic court incident. Should I tell her you're not available?" "No, I'll take it." David picked up the phone, curious about how a local news station had learned about his situation. "This is David Williams. Mr. Williams, this is Rebecca Chen from Channel 7 News. I understand you had an interesting experience in traffic court number 3 yesterday. Would you be willing to share your story?" "How did you hear about this?" "We received a tip from someone who was in the courtroom. They said they witnessed what appeared to be discriminatory treatment by Judge Mitchell. When we looked into it further, we discovered you're a federal prosecutor. That makes this newsworthy." David hesitated. Going public would certainly put pressure on Judge Mitchell and the court system, but it would also thrust David into a spotlight he wasn't sure he wanted. "Can I ask who contacted you?" "I can't reveal sources, but I can tell you that several people have reached out about Judge Mitchell's courtroom behavior. Your case seems to be part of a larger pattern." That got David's attention. "What kind of pattern?" "Different treatment based on race, social class, and appearance. We've been investigating complaints about judicial bias in local courts. Your case could be the key to a larger story." David made his decision. "I'd be willing to speak with you, but I want to make something clear. This isn't just about me. It's about systemic problems that affect everyone who can't fight back. That's exactly the story we want to tell. 2 hours later, David found himself sitting across from Rebecca Chen in a downtown coffee shop, speaking on record about his experience. The reporter was thorough, asking detailed questions about the traffic stop, the court proceeding, and Judge Mitchell's behavior. "What bothers me most," David explained, "is that I only got fair treatment after the judge discovered my profession. That suggests the problem isn't just individual bias, it's institutional. How many other people face the same treatment without having the credentials to challenge it?" "Have you filed a formal complaint?" "Yes. I submitted a detailed report to the State Judicial Conduct Board this morning. I've also been in contact with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division." Rebecca leaned forward. "The DOJ is involved?" "When federal prosecutors witness civil rights violations, we have an obligation to report them. Judge Mitchell's behavior suggests a pattern of discriminatory treatment that could violate constitutional protections." The story aired that evening during the 6 o'clock news. Rebecca had done her homework, interviewing other attorneys who had appeared before Judge Mitchell, and finding several people willing to share similar experiences. The report painted a picture of a judge who consistently treated defendants differently based on race and social class. David's phone started ringing almost immediately. First, it was colleagues from the U.S. Attorney's Office expressing support. Then came calls from civil rights organizations, other attorneys, and community activists who had been dealing with similar issues for years. But the most important call came from Antonio Rodriguez, a young public defender who had been fighting an uphill battle against judicial bias in local courts. "Mr. Williams, I've been trying to get attention for these issues for 3 years," Antonio said. "I have files full of documented cases where Judge Mitchell and other judges showed clear bias. But nobody listened because my clients don't have power or influence." "What kind of documentation?" "Court transcripts, audio recordings, witness statements. I've been building a case, but I needed someone with credibility to help bring attention to it." David felt a surge of energy. "Let's meet tomorrow. Bring everything you have." The next morning, David's office looked like a war room. Antonio had brought boxes of files documenting discriminatory treatment in multiple courtrooms. They spread transcripts across David's conference table, highlighting patterns of bias that were impossible to ignore. "Look at this," Antonio pointed to a transcript from one of Judge Mitchell's cases. "Same day as your hearing, a white businessman got a traffic ticket dismissed because he claimed he was late for an important meeting. But the Latino construction worker before him got a lecture about responsibility when he said he needed to get to work." David studied the documents, his prosecutorial instincts kicking in. "This isn't just about Judge Mitchell. You have evidence of systemic bias across multiple courts." "Exactly. Mitchell is just the most obvious example because he doesn't try to hide it. They spent the day organizing evidence and building a comprehensive case. David used his connections in the federal system to ensure the right people saw the documentation. By evening, they had formal complaints filed with the Judicial Conduct Board, the State Attorney General's Office, and the Department of Justice. The response was swift. Judge Mitchell was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The state chief judge announced a comprehensive review of judicial conduct policies, and the local bar association called for mandatory bias training for all judges. But David knew the real change would come from sustained pressure and public attention. He agreed to speak at a town hall meeting organized by community activists, where he shared the stage with people who had been fighting these issues for years without recognition. "What happened to me was wrong," David told the crowd of about 200 people. "But what happens to people in our community every day in these courtrooms is equally wrong. The only difference is that I had the privilege and position to fight back." An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. "My grandson got a heavy fine from Judge Mitchell for a minor violation. We couldn't afford a lawyer, so he just paid it. How many others are out there like him?" "Too many," David replied. "That's why this isn't just about one judge or one case. It's about changing a system that treats people differently based on assumptions and stereotypes." After the meeting, David was approached by Dr. Patricia Johnson, a local civil rights leader who had been fighting discrimination for decades. "Mr. Williams, I appreciate what you're doing, but I need to ask you something," she said. "Will you still care about this issue 6 months from now when the cameras are gone and the attention has moved on to something else?" It was a fair question. David had seen too many cases where outrage flared up briefly and then faded away, leaving the underlying problems unchanged. "Dr. Johnson, I prosecute civil rights violations for a living. This isn't a hobby for me. It's my job, and after what I experienced, it's also personal." "Good," she smiled. "Because we're going to need sustained effort to create real change. These problems didn't develop overnight, and they won't be solved overnight." David nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Help us establish a judicial monitoring program. Train volunteers to observe court proceedings and document patterns of bias. Use your legal expertise to challenge unfair practices. And keep telling your story so people understand that this affects everyone." Over the following weeks, David found himself at the center of a growing movement for judicial reform. He worked with community groups to establish court monitoring programs, helped train volunteers to recognize signs of bias, and used his position to push for systemic changes. The media attention brought additional complaints against Judge Mitchell and other judges. The State Judicial Conduct Board announced it was expanding its investigation to include multiple courts, and for the first time in years there was real momentum for meaningful reform. But David also learned that change comes with a cost. Some of his colleagues questioned whether he should be getting involved in what they saw as local political issues. A few judges in federal court seemed cooler toward him, and he received several anonymous messages suggesting he should focus on his own job instead of stirring up trouble. David didn't let the pressure deter him. He had seen firsthand how the system could fail people who deserved better, and he had the skills and position to help fix it. The real test would come when Judge Mitchell's case was resolved and the media attention died down. Would the reform stick? Would the monitoring programs continue? Would judges actually change their behavior? David was determined to find out. Because justice delayed is justice denied, but justice achieved can change everything. 6 months after David's confrontation with Judge Mitchell, he stood in the same courthouse where his ordeal had begun. But this time, he wasn't alone. The hallway buzzed with activity as reporters, community activists, and legal observers gathered for the announcement of the Judicial Conduct Board's findings. David had spent those 6 months working tirelessly with community groups to document patterns of bias in local courts. The volunteer monitoring program they'd established had produced dozens of case studies showing discriminatory treatment. What started as one man's traffic ticket had evolved into a comprehensive examination of judicial fairness across the entire county. Antonio Rodriguez approached David with a thick folder under his arm. "The final report is even stronger than we hoped," he said. "The Conduct Board found clear evidence of bias in Mitchell's courtroom, and they're recommending systematic reforms." "What about the other judges we documented?" 3 others are facing formal censure. The chief judge has ordered mandatory bias training for all sitting judges, and they're implementing new oversight procedures. David felt a sense of satisfaction, but he knew the real test would be whether these changes actually improved treatment for ordinary citizens who found themselves in traffic court. Rebecca Chen from Channel 7 spotted David and walked over with her camera operator. "Mr. Williams, are you satisfied with the Conduct Board's findings?" "It's a good start," David replied. "Judge Mitchell is being held accountable for his actions, and the system is implementing reforms. But the real measure of success will be whether people are treated fairly 6 months from now, when the cameras aren't rolling." The courthouse doors opened, and officials from the Judicial Conduct Board emerged to make their announcement. David joined the crowd gathering around the courthouse steps. "After a thorough investigation lasting 6 months," announced Board Chair Margaret Thompson, "we have found that Judge Harold Mitchell engaged in conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. Judge Mitchell showed clear bias in his treatment of defendants based on race and social class, refused to consider evidence, and abused his judicial authority." A murmur went through the crowd. David noticed several community members he'd met at town hall meetings nodding with approval. "Judge Mitchell is hereby formally censured and suspended from the bench for 6 months without pay. He will be required to complete 40 hours of bias training and sensitivity education before returning to duty. Additionally, all cases decided by Judge Mitchell over the past 2 years will be reviewed for potential bias. The announcement continued with details about the broader reforms being implemented. All judges would undergo annual bias training. Court proceedings would be randomly monitored by trained observers, and a new citizen complaint process would make it easier for people to report discriminatory treatment. After the announcement, David was surrounded by reporters asking for his reaction, but he noticed Dr. Patricia Johnson standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, and he excused himself to speak with her. "How do you feel about the outcome?" he asked. Dr. Johnson smiled, but her expression was thoughtful. "It's more than we've ever achieved before. But I keep thinking about all the people who faced the same treatment over the years and had no way to fight back." "We can't undo the past," David said, "but we can make sure it doesn't happen in the future." That's the hope. The question is whether these reforms will actually change behavior or just create better paperwork. David understood her skepticism. Real change in institutional behavior was notoriously difficult to achieve. That's why the monitoring program is so important. We need sustained oversight to make sure the reforms are actually implemented. Over the following months, David continued working with community groups while maintaining his full-time prosecutor duties. The court monitoring program expanded to include volunteers from law schools, retired teachers, and community activists. They attended court sessions regularly, documenting how judges treated different defendants and whether the promised reforms were making a difference. The results were encouraging, but mixed. Some judges clearly modified their behavior, showing more patience with defendants and considering evidence more carefully. Others seemed to resent the oversight and found subtle ways to continue discriminatory practices. Judge Mitchell returned to the bench after his suspension, visibly changed by his experience. David heard from other attorneys that Mitchell was much more careful in his treatment of defendants, though whether this represented genuine reform or simply fear of further consequences remained to be seen. The most significant change came from an unexpected source. The publicity around David's case had inspired other legal professionals to speak up about bias they'd witnessed. A group of public defenders, prosecutors, and private attorneys formed a coalition to push for broader criminal justice reforms. David found himself invited to speak at law schools, judicial conferences, and community events across the region. His story became a case study in how individual courage could spark systemic change. But the moment that meant the most to David came on a quiet Tuesday morning in Traffic Court Number 3. He was there observing as part of the monitoring program, when he saw a young black woman approach the bench to contest a parking ticket. The new judge, Mitchell's temporary replacement, listened carefully to her explanation about the broken meter and her elderly grandmother's medical emergency. Without hesitation, he dismissed the citation and wished her well. "That's how it should work," whispered Maria Santos, a community volunteer who was observing with David. "Fair treatment regardless of who you are." David nodded, remembering his own experience in that same courtroom. The difference was striking and encouraging. After the session, David and Maria walked outside together. The courthouse steps where the Judicial Conduct Board had announced their findings now seemed like any other government building, busy with people going about their daily business. "Do you think the changes will stick?" Maria asked. David considered the question carefully. "Some will, some won't. But we've created awareness and accountability that didn't exist before. And we've shown that ordinary people can challenge the system when it's unfair." "What's next?" "We keep watching, we keep documenting, and we keep pushing for reform. This was never going to be a one-time fix." As they walked away from the courthouse, David reflected on how much had changed since that evening when Officer Jenkins had pulled him over in Willowbrook. What started as personal injustice had become a community movement that was making real differences in people's lives. His phone buzzed with a text message from Antonio Rodriguez. "New judge in county. Court B seems to be showing bias in sentencing. Can you help us document it?" David smiled and typed back, "On my way." The work was far from over. But David had learned that meaningful change was possible when people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. His traffic ticket had cost him $775 that he never should have had to pay. But it had also sparked reforms that would benefit countless others for years to come. 6 months later, David received a letter that surprised him. It was from Judge Mitchell, written in careful handwriting on personal stationery. "Mr. Williams," it read, "I want you to know that the past year has been the most difficult but educational of my career. I've come to understand that my behavior in the courtroom was not just wrong but harmful to the very system I took an oath to serve. The bias training and community service I completed opened my eyes to perspectives I had never considered. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I am committed to being a better judge and a better person. Thank you for having the courage to speak up when speaking up was difficult." David read the letter twice, then filed it away. Whether Judge Mitchell's change of heart was genuine would be proven by his actions over time, not by his words in a letter. But it was a reminder that even in a flawed system, people could change, and institutions could improve. It just took courage, persistence, and the belief that justice wasn't just an ideal, but an achievable goal. David returned to his office and the stack of federal cases waiting for his attention. But he also kept his commitment to the community groups working for reform. Because he had learned that justice wasn't something that happened automatically. It was something that had to be fought for, defended, and protected every single day. The fight continued, but now David knew he wasn't fighting alone.